I'm an intensive care specialist and I have a particular interest in sepsis, which is life-threatening infection. And I moved back to Adelaide about 18 months ago. I came here to lead the research unit at the Royal Adelaide and had no funding to my name, and applied for funding with the Hospital Research Foundation Group to fund a project looking at megadose vitamin C for sepsis. And so I'm extremely grateful to the help of the Hospital Research Foundation in funding that work.
Our group is focused on the interplay between viruses and our immune system, a very topical topic of research. And during the course of the last 3 years, we have worked closely with the clinicians at the Royal Adelaide Hospital, such as Mark, at the intensive care unit and infectious diseases, running a statewide COVID study in South Australia, as well as developing new vaccines against COVID. A lot of the federal focus is on the eastern states, and what was very important to us is to showcase that South Australia is more than capable of being at the forefront of this type of research, that we have the know-how, we have the technology, and we have the capability in South Australia.
I'm a colorectal surgeon, so most of my work is focused on bowel cancer. I've been back to Adelaide now just over 5 years, and our unit or our team specifically focuses on patient outcomes research in bowel cancer. And that takes a variety of forms, but bowel cancer is a lot more common than I think people realize. It's the third most common cancer in Australia, and it's the second biggest killer of Australians in terms of cancer, second only to lung cancer. Just to put it in perspective, breast cancer unfortunately claims about 3,000 Australians a year, same with prostate cancer, about 3,000 Australians a year. Bowel cancer claims about 5,000 Australians a year. And so what we're focused on is how do we target the treatment options that we have in the best possible way to get the best outcome for patients. And that's different for every patient, because they present with different disease types and different disease biology. The Hospital Research Foundation was instrumental in setting me up. So in the first 2 years that I arrived here, I really needed some resources to get the research program off the ground. And you guys funded somebody called Tracy Fitzsimmons, who's in the audience today. And without her, I don't think we could have got as far as we have in the last few years. So thank you very much for that, I appreciate it.
And so staying with you, Tarik, one of the things that you and your team have been able to do is to bring some alternative surgical practices into the Royal Adelaide Hospital. Can you talk a little bit about some of those things?
In the past, I suspect the surgery was being done in multiple hospitals by multiple clinicians, but without any sort of coordinated effort to try and do the surgery more comprehensively. And as a result, a lot of patients would have to be transferred interstate for their surgery because there was no service offered here that could address that. And over the last 5 years, I'm proud to say that we've moved in a different direction, and we've slowly been able to build up a service where most South Australians, and in fact most Northern Territorians as well, down to South Australia, can now have their surgery a little bit closer to home in a way that we would regard as world-class.
Branka, COVID changed the playing field a little bit about how quickly we can bring virus or vaccines on. How did it impact your work in a positive way?
For years I have been saying the vaccines are victims of their own success, that we have eradicated so many childhood diseases that I didn't have to have 10 kids in a hope that 2 will reach adulthood. That's what vaccines have done for mankind. So COVID really exposed our preparedness to act quickly, because we've had these technologies that we have spent the last 15 years working on, such as mRNA technology. Everybody says that it's a very new type of vaccine, but it's actually a technology that's gone to phase 1 clinical trials. But usually what happens is the disease will wane, and the interest in further developing the vaccine stops, because a lot of money is required. So I think what COVID exposed is that when enough money is put into medical research, things can happen very quickly.
Mark, when I read your proposal, I mean, I don't make these decisions, but when I read your proposal, I went out and bought about 16 packets of vitamin C tablets. But tell us a little bit, how did this come about? How did your work come about?
So sepsis is life-threatening infection. So if you have a chest infection, it's when that chest infection enters the bloodstream and the whole body shuts down. Equally, if you have a urinary tract infection, it can spread to the bloodstream and the whole body shuts down. And 1 in 5 people worldwide die from sepsis. It's a huge problem, yet it's not really in the local lexicon. People don't talk about it. And in the intensive care unit, when I'm working and a patient comes in with septic shock, it's sort of batten down the hatches time. So about 1 in 3 patients will die from septic shock in the intensive care unit, and that's despite all the machines and all the tricks that we've got up our sleeve. And vitamin C has been tried for decades, and the doses that have been given have been very low. And vitamin C is unique in that it is very, very safe, so even at high doses. And so we thought, why not go large and give an enormous dose? And so we thought 2,500 times an orange would be about the right dose.
This is orally?
No, this is intravenously. And the effect that we saw was, without antibiotics, extraordinary. So we've had scientists working in this field for 30, 40 years and we haven't seen an effect like it. And so now we have got the funding to roll it out into clinical trials, and the help from the Hospital Research Foundation has recently been able to leverage into a very large national grant, which is still under embargo, so I can't tell all the details, but we're able to get another $5 million to do this properly and to do a double-blind trial to really define whether or not this is going to be an effective treatment in humans.
I think this is really good. Yeah. And so it leads me on to how do we roll some of these things out, Tarik? How do we roll out what you're doing to other other hospitals and things like that? You're making some remarkable inroads. What is the translation pathway?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Look, the reality is that, for example, speaking for the Royal Adelaide Colorectal Unit, the services are not offered to people who live in the city specifically. It's offered to the entire state, and in fact, 2 and a bit states. And so that's, I guess, the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that when you improve outcomes for patients, it's impossible to ignore that. And it's amazing how quickly some of that information translates across multiple jurisdictions. So with the example of total neoadjuvant therapy, which I know you've heard a bit about, Paul, where we give a lot of the radiotherapy and chemotherapy up front, and in about half the patients, or just under, surgery is no longer required because the tumor is cured without surgery or removed without surgery. Initially, that started out early at the Royal Adelaide, perhaps earlier than some other places, but within a year or two, it was rapidly rolled out across the state. And somewhere like South Australia is now considered a leader in that type of treatment in the country.
Viruses have been topical, obviously, in the last 3 years, and vaccines have been topical. How do we ensure that the point you made earlier, that there are children living today because of vaccines, how do we make sure that impetus that's come in the last 3 years keeps going? And your clinical trials that you're undertaking, what sort of indicators are we getting from those things?
As with any medical research, we ensure that it continues by funding it adequately. So I think that's, COVID is here to stay, and COVID is not going away. And the biggest impact of COVID on our society will be long COVID. So it's bigger than us.
Describe long COVID.
Long COVID is a manifestation of a number of different physiological problems that people experience months, even a year after they've had initial infection. It doesn't necessarily happen to people that had severe COVID. It's most commonly associated with people with mild COVID. And this is something that's going to affect our healthcare system, our workforce the most, because it's a chronic fatigue syndrome. These people have got respiratory problems, they're unable to work. But vaccination does reduce the risk of long COVID significantly. So going forward, this is something that we as researchers and scientists have to keep up, and we have to avoid the vaccination and the COVID fatigue, that people have had enough of talk of vaccines and COVID. We've had to live our lives and adjust based on the pandemic for so many years. So we need to keep on educating people about the virus itself, what it does, and why it's necessary to continue with vaccination campaigns.
And we're very proud, and I hope all people here are very proud. We've been supporting Branka's research now for almost 10 years, since you're 13, and we're very proud of the work that you've been able to do. So fantastic. But now the rubber hits the road. You've got hopefully a big chunk of money, and I would suggest you're probably putting a lot of time into the planning of the next steps. What are the next steps?
So the next steps are we are going to do a smallish study to understand the appropriate dose. So because we're at really the upper threshold that's ever been given, I don't know how much is too much, or if there is too much. And so we've got to work out what the right dose is, which we're going to conduct in a small trial with 4 centres across Australia. And then in about 2 years' time, we'll be in a position to conduct an international multi-centre randomised controlled trial that will, I look to recruit between 500 or 600 patients. And with that sort of number, we will have the power in that study to really answer the question. This will transform the management of one of the most common causes of human mortality worldwide.
There is an untapped resource of researchers out there, and it is a pity that we can't fund everybody. But from your perspective, you're in front of a whole group of supporters and donors. Give them your best pitch, Tarik.
Everybody, I think, who knows me knows that my one-liner. If it doesn't have an immediate impact on the next patient you see, don't bother. And so we, generally speaking, will not pursue any research projects that do not have an immediate impact. It doesn't have to be a positive impact, it just has to be a question that needs to be answered for the next patient. And so we really go pretty hard on that line. And we've chosen research programs, RCTs and otherwise, where the result will definitely inform what we do on the next patient that we have to treat. And so I would say when you're looking to fund certain projects, make that a priority, is what I would recommend.
My pitch is that we need to fund discovery science. So I really don't like that we tend to talk of discovery science as basic research or basic science. There's nothing basic about it. And without this, I understand the need for translational impact. But if we are continually funding things that are getting translated, our pipeline is going to run out.
Yeah.
We need to discover new things, and those things need to be funded. And not every single, hardly, 1 in 10 may get to a translational path, but exactly what you said, it's vitally important. So the funders need to take the risk into novel ideas, high-risk ideas, and allow the scientists and researchers to be scientists, to try to discover and fail and try again and fail again, but try better.
Promote local research, and we have donors in the audience who are from Adelaide donating to an Adelaide-based foundation. I have been researching in the UK for several years. I spent a lot of time in big centres in Melbourne, and I've recently come back to Adelaide, and this is a really ripe environment for amazing research. We shouldn't have a small town mentality when it comes to research here in Adelaide. There are some extraordinary scientists, some extraordinary minds, and a lot of it has to be funded by Adelaide people, so you in the audience. And so donating to the Hospital Research Foundation and supporting local researchers has a really profound impact internationally and helps stimulate the local science and local minds. So thank you all for donating to the Hospital Research Foundation.